This is the third in a three-part series of building this heavy hatchet, starting with a fresh split, full moisture honey locust log for the handle, and then taking a lot of weight off of a full-size felling axe to make it light enough to swing with one hand. So this is intended for one or two-handed use. I call this version of an axe a 20-inch workhorse. It's just a good all-round camp chore axe. I use it for heavy craft work, truck axe. I need to do testing before I do all the final refinements on this. I'm going to chop, split, and hew. Those three basic tests I do on every axe I build to get a general sense of how it performs, because there's no one-size-fits-all for axes. Different axes are going to be better or worse at these different tasks. Some can be decent all-rounders. This one should. But I want to have a good sense of that so I can match them up with my customers' intended uses. This is not even sharp, so it's ground more or less with the proper and appropriate geometry, but certainly no real edge on it. There's no top wedge yet, and I want to be able to do these tests and still take the handle off easily to, if I need to regrind something. For instance, I haven't even wire wheeled the head and I don't want the handle on in the way when I do that step. I also want to be able to work on the handle because it's not done either. I'm feeling for overall roundness or the oval profile. I want to feel for any ridges that I haven't scraped down yet. I know that there's too much of a hump right here still already. So again, being able to take the head and handle apart and work on them separately is much easier than trying to do it as a unit. That's why I haven't top wedged it yet. So I just need to get into doing those tests before I go and finish building the axe. My very simple test for chopping is just that. I like to just cut some limb wood, and chopping is often used interchangeably to mean splitting. That's not the same. People say, I'm going to go chop some firewood. Technically, that's not what I'm doing here. Chopping means you're cutting across the grain of the fibers of the wood run this way, and you're severing those. When you split, you're just separating the longitudinal fibers, right? So this is properly chopping. Splitting is a separate test. This happens to be red oak. That's not terrible. Big old cicada killer wasp. So all I'm checking for is that I get a reasonably deep bite and a fairly easy release here. Get some decent chips coming up without too much effort. I'm not recommending that you break down your wood on the ground like this necessarily. That's just an expedient test for me. Now, I did become aware of this while chopping. My head is starting to just loosen a little bit. That's another part of this testing, is I want to see how much of a good frictional bind I have at the bottom of this eye. I mentioned previously I don't like this point because it digs into the wood. I also don't like this, my bad bandsaw cut here. I'd prefer to have a rounded ear kind of coming down. I would have more surface area for frictional binding, and I might get it to stay on a little better. Combined with the top wedge, this is just fine. Mainly I just want to be sure that the head doesn't come loose suddenly. It's going to loosen up incrementally, and this is great. So I've chopped 3 of these oak limbs in half, and chopping performance seems decent. It's not excellent at chopping, but it's, as I've said, an all-rounder, not dedicated to be excellent at one particular thing. Also, let's remember there's no edge on it yet, and it will definitely improve the chopping performance once it does have a proper edge. So for splitting, the edge shouldn't make really a bit of difference. It's entirely the overall wedge profile here that does the work. Some clear red oak. Great. So hewing is coming in like so, almost parallel to the workpiece. I do a lot of this to just clean up rough split blanks, whether for spoons or tool handles. So this is an important test for me, because for anyone who does any kind of craft work like this, you definitely want an axe that is acceptable at this, if not, dedicated for hewing. This is white oak that I'm cutting on, and that's exactly what I want to be able to do, is still have it bite, coming in very acute to the wood. What I don't want is a bunch of this bouncing. If that's happening a lot, that means I'm still too convex here and I need to grind it flatter. This seems pretty acceptable for an all-rounder, but I can still make it a tiny bit flatter as I do my final grinding and honing on it. So my 3 tests are done. That's chopping, splitting, and hewing. I'd call it pretty good at splitting, fair at chopping and hewing. That's all I need to know to proceed, and so now I'm ready to head to the basement workshop and get out of this miserable muggy weather. So that is the top of the actual axe head, that top line. And you can see the friction marks at the bottom of the eye. And so the line I need to cut to right there is about 3/4 the way down. And of course, having a guideline across the top and at the front and back doesn't hurt. So that's just a real quick mapping out the kerf that needs to be cut on this particular axe head. This head is now ready to install on the handle. Everything that I need to do to it off the handle is done. It's properly ground. It's all cleaned up. Bottom of the eye deburred, of course. Ready to go. Similarly, the handle's ready to go. There's a second round of scraping and finessing the feel in the hand. The kerf is cut to receive the wedge. And that's where we are. So the wedge is it's an issue in itself, and at least when I do a fitment, I custom make a wedge to fill this particular amount of void space. This is only found out through experience, so I have to subjectively sort of make an educated guess how much empty space I have to fill in here at the top, because we know we have good frictional binding all at the bottom. And I know the approximate depth of the wedge, so I have to create a wedge that has just the right amount of taper so it'll drive most of the way in, but not bottom out. Also, it needs to fill the full, fore aft dimension of the eye. And that's just subjectively determined. I'll custom shape and fit with the bandsaw primarily a wedge that will fill this space. I'm going to use poplar wood. It's a traditional choice for this, and I believe I understand the reason why. It's because poplar, it's softer than any wood you would use for a handle, but also you can beat on it, so when you drive that wedge in there, you don't want the top of the wedge to just blow apart from the impacts and splinter out. You want to be able to drive that wedge in pretty deep and it still remains mostly intact. A little minor benefit to poplar is it comes in a few different color tones. So I've selected some dark green heartwood poplar to contrast with this kind of salmon pink toned honey locust. So I'm going to rip this little board, cut myself off a chunk for the wedge, and custom shape that on the bandsaw. This is how I refine wedges. And of course the top of this will be cut off, but this at least lets me drive it without it blowing up. I mean, I do want some destruction, but not too much. So one other step that I always do for my wedges, because I don't use adhesives, I rely on friction, like old school. 200 years ago, what kept axe heads on handles? It was friction. They didn't have adhesives to rely on, and that means surface area of binding pressure. So on this soft wedge, I'm going to scratch across the grain and rough up the sides of this wedge on both sides. There, that was the first strike where it sheared. That's good. That's very good. So even though that wedge looked pretty gnarly as driven from the side, looks very clean from the top, but the look doesn't matter as much as what it's doing. This wedge is not held in by adhesives. Like I said, it's held in by friction. And there's a very even pressure all the way across the eye. This installation is complete. Came out very clean. I have a lot of confidence in the frictional binding both at the top and bottom of the eye. Also, it looks essentially visually flawless at the top and bottom of the eye, which is a minor concern, but if you can achieve that, why not, right? My next thing to address is the edge. So this is already catching a thumbnail just from the angle grinder cleanup I did earlier. But I want this to arrive at the customer's door with the type of finish that's going to be very easy to maintain, but also not change its visual appearance as they maintain it. So I just have to put a quick file finish on this and it will shave, and it will be easy to maintain at or near a shaving sharpness with just a file. I did a coarse double cut and then a fine single cut filing. With a little bit of practice, this, in my experience, is the easiest way to make an axe consistently shaving sharp. Right off the file. And then the customer will be able to easily maintain this geometry and also that razor edge with nothing but a single cut fine mill file. This was supposed to be done, and everything turned out great that I had control over. But it turns out the blade is tempered a little too hard, and it got a chip when I was hewing that Osage orange. Osage is a very hard wood, one of the hardest that grows in North America. And it's not a ding, it's a chip. So that means the steel is a little too hard for general use. And I have a choice to make. I could just grind out the chip and consider this a dedicated splitter, because splitting really doesn't put near the kinds of stresses on edges that hewing and chopping does. Or I can unmount the head from the handle, retemper the steel, just put it in a toaster oven for a couple hours, and reinstall it. And I think that's my inclination, is to keep this as an all-round use axe. Plus, a slight benefit would be that the retempering will slightly soften the bit and make it a little easier to file, a little easier to maintain for whoever ends up owning it. So that means we now have part 4 in this series. So stay tuned for that. And also go back and check out parts 1 and 2 if you're interested, if you haven't seen those. And I'm going to get to work here pulling this wedge.